So welcome back to the Talking Hedge. I'm Josh Kincaid, and this is your Cannabis Business Podcast. Today we're talking about automation and innovation in the hemp and cannabis industry. We are here live at the World Trade Center. I'm here with Arnar and Denny. They're with Greenvault Systems. I'm here with Jason of 420 Wholesale Pack, and then there's Andy of Poseidon Asset Management.
Innovation can be described as something that transforms a market or creates a new one through simplicity, convenience, affordability, and accessibility. So from your experience, how do you describe disruptive innovation? Can you give any examples, and what's the best way to disrupt the market?
I think I'd break that out into, a few aspects of context. So first things first, the cannabis industry is in of itself rather disruptive. And I think that context is important because I think in broader technology, pharma, beverage, et cetera, marginal innovation isn't really applauded that much. So, whereas in the cannabis industry, simply taking something and being the X of cannabis can actually be very beneficial. And so I think in the context of cannabis, sometimes marginal innovation is the best track and actually the safest route. So I'd use a good example of actually an investment we're very proud of, which is Hedge, which is actually a data analytics company. They use actually machine learning to harvest, POS, point of sale data, real time, aggregate it, and summarize it in a meaningful way. Whereas I think in the broader market, I think being the Nielsen of cannabis might be something that looks like piggybacking and not awarded in the same way. Given the challenges and the hurdles that exist in cannabis, this is actually extraordinarily useful. And actually, I think it's really ironic that Headset used to market themselves as the Nielsen of cannabis because they've actually recently partnered with Nielsen. And whereas, Nielsen might be looking at the industry and you might think that, once safe banking occurs and once the States Act is passed, this might be something that Nielsen comes in and floods the market and it crushes, companies like Headset. The nuance of cannabis are so unique that there's actually a very large moat here. And Nielsen sees the advantage of partnering with a company like Headset, allowing them to grow organically within the space, and actually see them more as a takeout target, someone to acquire and bolt onto their core operations rather than attempting to actively manage that space on their own. And so I think that's one perspective, kind of this marginal disruption perspective. I think you also have true raw organic disruption, which is much more rare. I use the example that we're all familiar with Delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol. And when we ingest that, it's actually partially oxidized in the liver enzymatically, and it becomes 11-hydroxy tetrahydrocannabinol. And I actually had the pleasure of just recently speaking with some great companies in New York City and kind of picking their brains on where they see the beverage market going. And all these companies are kind of pursuing this marginal disruption approach. They're experimenting with different surfactants and different emulsification technologies, but in the grand scheme of things, this is marginal disruption and it's poised for a new player to come in. And if you can actually metabolize Delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol to 11-hydroxy tetrahydrocannabinol, that cannabinol is already water soluble. And so there'd be none of these issues with turbidity or surfactants kind of interacting with different drugs. And so I think that's one area where true raw scientific disruption is great and something to be applauded. Whereas the broader industry really just needs this marginal disruption, entrepreneurs to come in and bring the same services that any institutional established player would have, like Coca-Cola or Pfizer, et cetera, and market those to cannabis and tailor them also to be, optimized for this unique space.
We'll be citing Headset's data analytics in a couple of items here on the podcast. But yeah, data is definitely the second largest investment vehicle behind multi-state operators. Harvest just got bought out by Canopy for $3.4 billion, and then so the third investment vehicle is Cannabis Cafes, and we haven't even seen that. So that is huge. It's going to definitely define I think what happens. So we'll be citing Headset's data analytics in a couple of items here on the podcast. But yeah, data is definitely the second largest investment vehicle behind multi-state operators. Harvest just got bought out by Canopy for $3.4 billion, and then so the third investment vehicle is Cannabis Cafes, and we haven't even seen that. So that is huge. It's going to definitely define I think what happens. So with that automation, Arnar or Denny, there seems to be a disconnect between what we think of as innovative products and what our clients think are innovative. So I'm curious, what does product innovation really look like? We could talk about cutting edge ingredients and functionality, packaging, technology and information, or brand new concepts that no one's ever seen before. But are those really the things that consumers want and are willing to purchase? Is a market leader the face of global competition? Is the ability to respond rapidly to changing customer requirements and niche opportunities? Is maintaining a competitive edge in times of turbulent, shifting global economics, or is it developing optimum manufacturing process to increase market share? Ultimately, whatever it is, what defines successful automation solutions for you and your clients?
This is more of the process automation side than the product innovation. I look at it as kind of four pillars of a successful production and automation. You look at efficiency in the process. You got you need to analyze, look at the throughput based on your customer's needs. You're looking for labor savings. Of course, that's the biggest piece of efficiency. Product quality is obviously, especially in this industry, where you have a very competitive market. You're sharing shelf space in dispensaries with many other producers, so your quality stands out and drives your sales, and you get better pricing for your product. In equipment, innovation, engineering, you want to design, especially in this product being as unique as it is. You want to design for the product itself. There's other engineering and equipment providers out there that are trying to bring in equipment designed for packaging peanuts or jelly beans, things like that. They work great for those products, not very good for cannabis, especially for the flower. So besides efficiency, product quality, you want to look at overall product yield. You want to get the most for your product, most value. In our space where we spend a lot of our engineering efforts is for net weight packaging, which most products or most markets require. Their accuracy in weighing and packaging, minimizes your overpack, which reduces your loss and increases your yield. The fourth one being equipment reliability. We spend a lot of time making sure that the equipment we run or that we provide our customers is reliable. Weyerhaeuser several years ago did a study on where their costs in manufacturing lie. Where were the highest costs? Mm-hmm. And they found by far and away the highest cost in manufacturing and production is downtime. And so engineering your equipment to run reliably day in, day out without the downtime is a key component to engineering.
Those are two big factors. There was a report that just came out about how Washington only is using about 50% of its capacity to grow, whereas Canada is growing so much, but nobody wants it. And I think that's more about quality control than actual production. But ultimately, it's about knowing the product. We spoke offline about talking with traditional tobacco manufacturers and how they're not really willing to work with the industry, but they want to know about it, but they have no idea about the product. And they're asking me for pictures of what the end joint is supposed to look like. And if they can't manufacture to that exact specifications, they won't even try. And so there's really a disconnect, I think, between some of the manufacturers and some of the buyers, obviously, being so new. And it's going to be interesting to see who produces what when you have people coming into the industry who know absolutely nothing about it.
What defines successful automated manufacturing as it pertains to your pre-roll machine?
Consistent product efficiency and savings in significant savings in manpower. It's moving. It's a technology that moves rolling, into the 21st century. And I think and beyond that is significant period of testing, where I think it's been running now for 4 years. The first machine in an Israeli LP, and now we have 4 machines running with them. And the operator is that good. It's one operator running 4 machines. So, and they're producing about 90% of the cones used by medical cannabis users in Israel. Wow. So efficiency, accuracy, and a great track record. So it's been completely debugged. So I think that's the highest value.
Andy, I wanted to ask you a follow-up question to that. How often are you seeing companies capitalizing on advances in or automated technologies?
So it's a great question, and really the simple answer is not enough. It's actually something I wrestle with as sort of an investor and individual in the space. You hear the story all the time. A software engineer from Google quits his job and wants to produce an edibles, branded edibles company out of his kitchen. Well, I totally applaud the entrepreneurialism and the spirit and the drive. That's not something that's actually durable and will work in this industry in 5 or 10 years when, especially as we look at safe banking and I think eventually the States Act, there are so many people waiting at the sidelines. There's the Coca-Colas of the world. There's the Hershey's of the world. These massive players that want to come in and bring in this truly institutional, established technology and again, to the point about efficiency and optimization, essentially blow these guys out of the water. So the simple answer is it's not happening enough, but I think increasingly people are recognizing that, if you want to produce an edible, producing in a small batch kitchen is not durable. And it's going to be about producing, full production lines and competing with true institutional players, just like in any other market. In the grand scheme of things, cannabis, especially as it applies to manufactured goods, is just an ingredient. And by ingredient, I mean a commodity. And that will come down, and eventually it will be treated as such, and it will kind of lose this kind of cannabis bump that so many products do currently receive, where they're able to sell products that wouldn't necessarily exist in a truly mature market. So I think it's coming, but it's slow, and I think some of the catalysts in the forefront are going to be safe banking, which is going to really bring institutional capital. It's going to bring in serious investors, and that serious capital, just like what we're seeing up in Canada, it's going to allow the U.S.-based entrepreneurs to begin pursuing these true institutional machines. Which
we're going to dive into that major factor that's going to change the game. I think more than anything else, maybe even more than machinery and automation. I think the fact that people can get access to traditional banking services is going to allow them to gain access to the lending, the financing, to scale and even compete. So yeah, we'll get to that in a little bit.
Awesome.
And how often are you seeing companies trying to capitalize on advances in manufacturing technologies like your PreRoll machine?
Look, the industry is so new. Everybody is looking for new technologies. This is not an industry which has mass manufacturing. This is not an industry which has a history of big manufacturing or even huge companies being involved. And all of a sudden, they both have the quality of the product, consistent product, standards, be they local, national, or even international standards. Once you're into the field of medical products, this is all only a few years old. So new manufacturing technologies, especially as we've come to it at Festus, which is a company which has been in the food packaging industry for about 30 years. This is not new, but it is new for the cannabis manufacturers.
Yeah, I was on the phone with the FDA. They're coming up with some new requirements for all manufacturers of combustibles or inhalables like cigars, joints, cigarettes, and they're going to have requirements, which to my surprise, they didn't already. That's what I called them initially, is to find out what are the required materials to manufacture combustibles, and they didn't have any, but they are creating them. So I think if you're using stainless steel and other, non-plastics, essentially, I think you'll be fine.
All the machine is built to food grade. Those are the machines. It's like I said, it's not a lot of surprise here for us.
Right.
We, for example, have a little device that prints on the cone, and it's all edible inks. So there's for the food industry has been ahead of this for a long time. I don't think the FDA is going to be inventing too much, which will surprise people who are familiar with the food industry.
I would agree with that.
But Jason wanted to talk to you a little bit about the volatility. Washington State recently tried to implement rule changes that would have affected over 70% of the edibles market and would have resulted in higher compliance costs and possibly lost market share. So what did we learn, or what advice can you give to companies in emerging cannabis markets on how to prepare for a volatile regulatory market? I remember when we were in Vegas, you showed me this in-house printer and how just something as simple as that is, I don't even know if you can consider that innovation, but in this industry it is, because if you wait for labels from China, for example, they're obsolete en route with these quick changes. So I don't know, what can you do, or what can you offer, advice or otherwise, for companies that are getting into the emerging markets and dealing with the volatile regulatory environment?
Yeah, so I've been in this industry for about 4 years now, and so I've seen a lot of changes regulatory-wise through that period of time. I've seen a lot of my customers go through a ton of pain, throwing huge quantities of packaging in the garbage because of a regulatory change. That can bankrupt companies. If you make a huge investment on a new branded package, and all of a sudden the LCB decides they're going to change the edibles rules, they don't give you a heads up about that before that necessarily happens always. And so they're getting better about it. The LCB is, to their credit, getting a little bit better about giving us longer lead times to adapt to these rule changes. But in the early days, it was awful. I had many customers were literally, like you were saying, they've got a big order of branded packaging on the water coming from China. By the time it's landed, it's just going in the garbage.
And $40,000 is a lot of money for these companies, and if they lose on that could really change their strategy.
Yeah, and we've seen that, and so we've kind of learned through our customers throughout the years, being in this really regulated industry, that while you can get some really good, inexpensive, quality-looking packaging if you work with the right people from overseas, there's still those lead times. Even if you air freight it, you're looking at 4 to 6 weeks typically. And so that's not quick enough in our industry. A lot of people I know that work in the industry, we kind of joke about cannabis industry like the dog years. Like 1 year is like the equivalent of 7 years in business, because it's so ever changing, and it's whether it's a regulatory change, or maybe it's just that strain loses its steam and it's not selling. And maybe you invested real heavy in something on your own decision, that you just were wrong about. And if you've got solutions like these printers where you can adapt quickly and edit and change your branding on the fly, you're not in that position where you're just throwing a ton of product, packaging in the dumpster, which is the money. I had many cases where I had customers where they're, I need to get this price on my label. Okay, we got to buy $40,000 to get that price. Okay, well, I'll buy that. And then, 6 months later, they're like, well, I threw $30,000 in the garbage. So did you get that price anymore? No, you didn't. You paid 4 times that price. So those kinds of things can really, ultimately bankrupt a business if you make enough of those bad decisions, or if it's not your decision-making process, but it's just the regulatory process that's making you kind of jump through all these hurdles. And so we found that these label printers really help address and kind of streamline that process, so that if there is a regulatory hurdle that has to change, you buy blank labels now, those don't ever really go. I mean, there's shelf life on them eventually, but you're not going to have to throw a blank label away. You can buy those in bulk, get that low label cost, and then you're printing on demand as you need it. It's also speed to market. So, if you're needing to get something tested, like everything's tested, if you need to get that terpene report on your label, you got to wait 2 to 4 weeks, even if you're using a local label printer. And so, if you've got a label printer in-house, you can get that oil report back, you can print that information that day, and you can be in the store by that evening. And that's a big game changer too. So that's not quite so much on the regulatory side, but that's just some of the other benefits of that. So whether it's a regulatory challenge, your own business decisions that were wrong, or just the market shifting rapidly, all those things can really jam up cannabis companies. And having automated tools so that you can kind of bring some of that branding control in-house is really, really important in my opinion.
Yeah, that's interesting because in a normal industry, you think of outsourcing to save money, but in this industry, it's not really the same. So it's a strategy for sure to stay on top. Yeah, that's interesting because in a normal industry, you think of outsourcing to save money, but in this industry, it's not really the same. So it's a strategy for sure to stay on top. So Arnar or Denny, there's some factors that should be considered when automating. So I found that companies typically use automation to address a number of opportunities, including increasing throughput, productivity, ensuring flexibility, eliminating variation while improving quality, agility, safety, and ergonomics. So feasibility is a necessary precondition for automating any given work activity. A second factor to consider is the cost of developing and deploying automation. You mentioned that before. So what other factors should a business consider when trying to innovate?
Well, I'll just touch on something that Jason just said, and that's in this industry now, we have all these states coming on. You know, we're in many states, our equipment is, and we see a lot of customers who want to automate. They want automatic jarring lines, or they want automatic bagging lines. And we have to walk them through that process a little bit, because these lines, while they may seem flexible, they're not necessarily flexible in terms of changes. So, and they can be very expensive. So, for example, you go out and find this jar that you like, you buy 1 million of them, and the regulations change, and all of a sudden now you're retooling your line to fit new packaging. Right. So that first initial step into the automation part, especially with packaging, with net weight packaging, you got to be really sure that you're ready to do this. And that's where we kind of come in to help some of these guys walk through this, because a lot of these people are not coming from a process background. They may have a nice a jar or a bag, and they can see the automation in their head, but to put all those things together and understand what might change just because the state decides tomorrow you can't package in these jars anymore, it has to have this type of lid, and well, that just doesn't work in my line. So those are some pitfalls that you'll have to go through, you know, early on in this industry, to not corner yourself into something that you've spent a lot of money on, and 6 months or a year later you can't use it, or you need to modify it, which can be expensive, especially on site. So those are some considerations. Also, as things become more automated, typically, if you look at the food industry as well, there's a lot of innovation in products, but the packaging, the presentation, kind of stays in line with what's popular at the time, unless somebody's going to jump out and do something brave. But it can reduce the number of the number of products that are available to the consumer. Because if I'm going to go and spend all my money on mass producing a product, I'm going to produce a lot of that product. I might not have all these different product lines that I have today because I do it manually. So those are some considerations to take into when you're doing these kind of product development and and production line development.
Ultimately, you mentioned that it's incredibly laborious to make pre-roll. So what automated options should be evaluated to try and reduce the cost of operations?
Every company has to define its production line, from raw material to what the market demands. And then once that is analyzed, a production line is developed. And with the capacities that the marketing people are projecting. I don't think it's unique to the cannabis business. It's a standard procedure for any product being brought to market by a manufacturer.
Right, you're able to twist the tops automatically, then working backwards, it fills it with high precise accuracy. There's a separate grinder as with every machine, but essentially it's turnkey. You have one person that can run 2 machines at a time, 2,000 an hour per machine. I'd say that's probably going to automate and reduce costs simultaneously.
Yeah, we think it's between 6 and 8 people per machine. That's to generate that amount of 12,000 cones a day. Typically, you need 6 to 8 people working hard. Our machine needs one person.
Yes, correct.
One person. Yeah.
Well, I know a team of 18 people here in Washington, the largest producer processor that makes joints here in Washington. They have 18 people on their line making pre-rolls, so it's ridiculous. It's incredibly expensive.
Well, send them a link. Send them a link to our video. We had a company we have people coming out to Israel. We're having three or four a week now coming out. We're flying all the way to Israel to see the machine operating, and we're getting orders.
Mm-hmm.
One of the Canadian companies came over, said, well, how long? We said, look, it'll take you, to 6 to 8 people. It'll take you 10 months, 8 to 10 months to pay off the machine, the full value of the machine. He says, you're wrong. Is it going to take me under 2 weeks? I said, how do you figure that? He said, we make $1.50 per cone, and within 2 weeks pay to the machine.
There's a lot of steps that go into it, and there's going to be a bud tender panel in July because all of these processes and steps and everything that goes into a finished cannabis product is almost wasted if the marketing and branding and packaging is flipped around just so the bud tender out of convenience can see the THC percentage on the back. So that's a topic for another podcast, but there's a lot that goes into it, and unfortunately, in the end, not all of it sells. And so, Andy, we're going to outline a solution which starts with developing a process, specifically define quality requirements. You can define the required minimum throughput versus output. You can consider the approximate floor space required and evaluate the ability to accommodate that, just like you mentioned. Defining an agreed upon purchase price with or without financing, considering the impacts of OSHA and other regulations and provisions. And so what automation options should be evaluated to try and reduce the cost of operations, and what types of financing are you seeing? Traditionally, there was convertible notes. I recently was hearing about debt financing, which is neat from a normalization standpoint. And then I kind of want to know about some other stuff like purchase order invoicing or factoring for people, like if they get a CVS order for their CBD product or whatever, if you're hearing anything about that yet.
Definitely. And first and foremost, you just brought up some great points. At a high level, in terms of, what a business owner should evaluate in terms of, automating and streamlining their operations. And it's sort of this fundamental question, finance. To what extent do you outlay capital today for a somewhat uncertain benefit down the road? And you brought up very good considerations about floor space considerations, and as well as the dynamics that one machine might play with another. Again, the simple answer is an entrepreneur should be considering all these items. But it's also very important to model them and think about them correctly. Purchasing one piece of equipment that is defunct due to other changes you've made 6 months down the road is just small in cash. And so really thinking about that critically and testing that in terms of sensitivity. If purchasing a new filling machine can take you from manually filling one pod at a time and racing to cap it before you've lost too many terpenes to evaporation, and you can go from 20 employees on that line down to one. Say convective shark filler that does 100 pods at once. That's an incredible efficiency, and it's, you can really straightforward see the cost savings from an investment like that. Where some other marginal changes might not, they fall into the fallacy of thinking about future revenue and thinking that if you can do 10x more pods, that you'll have 10x more revenue. That's not always the case, and I think it's smarter to think from the conservative track of direct cost savings than potential future revenue benefit, as it tends to be somewhat uncertain, and especially in this rapidly changing landscape, would be due to regulatory changes or due to something else that can erode very quickly. You have a really good point too about financing, and I'm actually gonna nerd out here. I'll give a bit of background. I'm a CPA by profession, and so I'm sure everyone's familiar with this 280E, this internal revenue code that, in short, makes you pay taxes on your gross margin as opposed to your net income. And there's some cool tricks you can do to essentially increase your cost of goods sold, reducing your gross margin and reducing your tax liability. Primarily, it's called absorption costing, and it's taking things like, say, equipment, and it's saying that this machine ran for 100 hours, produced 100 widgets. Using my depreciation method, that cost me $1,000. You can actually deduct that to cost of goods sold. So some of the benefits of actually leasing equipment and financing it as opposed to actually purchasing outright is that an operating lease, that is a lease where you don't own the machine. There's 4 tests that are designed to kind of categorize a lease between operating or capital. But an operating lease, without going through these fancy accounting absorption costing, can actually be deducted from your cost of goods sold. So from a value add proposition, it's very simple, very straightforward, and especially for small operators that aren't familiar with the tax nuances of Form 3114 and so on and so forth. It's a great avenue. But increasingly, there's financing for more traditional purchasing. I think with the hopeful imminent passage of the state's SAFE Act, you'll be able to get typical loans like you get on a car at a few percent, and not the 10, 15, and 20% that's currently characteristic of the industry. And that's going to be huge, because you brought up a good point about factoring, and this is something we deal with all the time with our portfolio companies, and I actually get the great pleasure of modeling that and kind of asking the question of, in this factoring scenario, what is the effective interest rate, and how does that compare to, say, taking a note out with any of the variety of funds or investors in the space. And the biggest piece of advice I give you is to be very cautious when looking at those financing options. When you truly model them out, when you think about them in terms of the grand scheme of things, I've seen effective interest rates as high as 60% for some factoring, which is incredible.
For 30 days, so 37%. All right, so Jason, we're on the cusp of a new automation era with rapid advances in robotics, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and machine learning, all enabling machines to match or outperform humans in a range of work activities, including joint rolling. So data analysis from McKinsey showed that as of 2015, 470 billion hours were spent on manufacturing-related activities globally that were automatable. $2.7 trillion of labor that could be eliminated or repurposed. So according to that McKinsey's research, manufacturing is second only behind food services in terms of automated potential, which doesn't bode well for the cannabis industry. So the predominance of repetitive, low-skilled activities in this group make cannabis highly susceptible to automation. There's low-skilled labor and low product complexity. So agricultural processing has an 80% chance of being automated. Food, 76%. Beverages, 69%. And so Wired Magazine had a story titled The Rise of Machines. The future has lots of robots, fewer jobs for humans. And it seems like this story's played out before, from automobiles to the internet. And so is massive job loss from the cannabis industry automation legitimate or hyperbole?
So I think it's probably both, depending on the time scale you're looking at. I think like what a lot of these articles are talking about outside of cannabis, I think just as a country, as a world, the robots are coming. I hear that a lot, and it's absolutely a truth. I mean, I've invested a lot of time and energy and resources in studying automation myself, and so I think if you're talking over a couple of decades, I think we all should be pretty concerned about it. But again, we also talked about cannabis being like dog years, and so I don't really know too many cannabis operators that are worried about 20 years down the road right now. They're thinking about maybe they have a 5-year plan at best. So I think if you're talking more on the 5-year plan, I don't think there's as much of a concern as far as like automation really wiping out employment opportunities right now. Because I think ultimately, it's still so new, and like they were talking about, if you're going to change a packaging line, all of a sudden you've got to completely rehaul your line potentially. So until we get a little bit more standardization, a little bit more confidence in certain pieces of technology that we know we can run for 5 or 10 years efficiently. I think until we hit those key points, I don't think there's going to be a rapid reduction in employment. But then you can also look at Canada, and I've read stories and seen pictures of 1 million square foot greenhouses that are fully automated for watering and basically very limited human interaction until they're actually harvesting. So in the short term, I don't think it's a huge concern. I have had a lot of growers that I talk to that are really great people that care about their employees, and they bring that up to me. They say, hey, I don't want to fire my employees that are good people. And I'm like, well, let's be honest, you probably don't have 100% great staff. And so, at this point, maybe that tabletop piece of automation gets rid of those 2 or 3 employees, and maybe they're even your friends, and they're just kind of coasting, They can stay your friends, and you can be good friends, but maybe they shouldn't be working for you anymore in a competitive industry. You need to make sure your workforce is working hard for the company to succeed. And so, if your person that's working for you, if their only skill set is applying labels by hand, that's probably not an employee you necessarily need to worry about keeping. But you could also look at a simple automated solution that's a couple grand, give them a tabletop applicator so that person still has a job, and now they're just more efficient. Now they're cranking out a lot of consistent, good-looking packaging. You didn't replace the person, you just made them more efficient. So you can really automate without replacing people, or you can automate and just get rid of the worst people in your company. Maybe you got a person that does labeling, and if you could fully automate that, maybe if they've got other skills, you can put them in marketing, you can put them on social media, you can put them in sales, other more valuable positions that can help your company succeed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, essentially reallocate your human capital from manufacturing to sales, for example.
There's a Wired magazine article that came out. It was titled "Rise of the Machines. The Future Has Lots of Robots and Fewer Jobs for Humans." But it seems like this story's kind of played out before, from automobiles to the internet. And so I'm wondering if massive job loss, in your opinion, from the cannabis automation is legitimate or hyperbole.
Well, this is the same challenge that the transportation industry is facing with driverless cars. We live in an age of technology where manual labor is going to be increasingly handed over to automated processes. Mm-hmm. Artificial intelligence is being introduced. We're living in a very, very exciting time. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely not unique to the cannabis industry, this challenge.
So, Arnar or Denny, there's benefits to automating systems that can be a powerful motive, but there's many pitfalls and obstacles, excuses that we've all heard. For example, I've heard some good quotes here. Quote, "We don't have the budget and are not familiar with the automation options available in the market," or "too little time and numerous issues that we need to address first," or quote, "it's not necessary." I like this one, though. "In this industry with tight margins, we don't invest in speculative capacity. Almost all capacity needs are driven by strategic business objectives to either increase market share or introduce a new product," which is perfect for headsets data to use. But on the flip side, quote, "If our customers don't need it, we don't buy it. And if they do, we better get it before somebody else will." And then the marketing dictates to us what the marketing is asking for, both in terms of product and in terms of anticipated volume requirements. So there's a lot of excuses and obstacles. But now that Washington State's investment residency requirements have been lifted, for example, what are some of the other current obstacles facing small business growth and success?
I think, primarily, for smaller businesses, a lot of this automation, like you alluded to, it can be expensive. It's very time consuming. You really have to understand, the entire process, what you're trying to automate, and that's what we try to help people with. Is they may have a few pieces that they can see in their head. There's a lot of other components to an automated line, such as controls, such as data, such as software, things like that that have to be really vetted out pretty heavily if you're going to be successful in these lines. So that can be a big obstacle for a small company because just the capital's not there. And it can take months. For a fairly robust line, say for capping, hermetically sealing, jar filling, labeling. That's a line that could take 4 or 5 months to put together. Mm-hmm. And the timeline, we go back to the dog years, even the dog months, right? You make a decision in June, and maybe that decision's not the same in January when your equipment's ready. So there's a lot of that to walk through with, especially smaller companies, because they're fighting all of these different battles. Labor, one of them, which is quite a bit. That's where our packaging machines or our weighing systems come in. That's the biggest bang for your buck on your floor, because you have people putting things in cups with chopsticks or Dixie cups or whatever on small scales. You can eliminate a lot of those people pretty quickly. Or repurpose those people, and as Jason was alluding to, we always tell people, look, you don't have to fire your staff here. You can repurpose them, make them more productive in your plant. Mm-hmm. Teach them something other than sitting in front of a scale for 8 hours a day. So there's a lot of things to consider. The bigger companies maybe are not so limited. They have maybe a little bit more capital. They have more people to put in to work with people like us to design a line or a process or a new piece of equipment. So those are struggles that these small companies today are seeing, that we see all the time. They could use the equipment. It's just, where are they going to put their dollars, right now? And that's not always it's not always in an equipment part of the company. It's maybe in an operational part of the company, or sales, or we need new salespeople, or we need to get out in front of more customers and get our product out. So, yeah, there's fighting for dollars in small companies for sure.
I'd like to just expand one thing on that. One thing for people who are considering automation, especially equipment automation on the floor, make sure you work with the right provider. Make sure that you work with someone who's going to take the time to understand your individual needs and like Denny said, work with you to make sure that it makes sense for you and that they put together the right solution that's going to work for you.
I think we were talking about offline. There's a company that's making a cylindrical joint, and they're from the tobacco industry, and they're requiring that they're in control of the entire stage. And so it's really important that you work with somebody who knows what they're doing, because when you don't, you're allowing somebody from another industry to dictate the finished product, and they don't know anything about it. So they're really mandating that you use all the same conveyor belts that tobacco uses when it's not really relevant. You're going to lose a lot of your trichomes and good stuff along the way, and so you want to shorten that distance. And so it's really important to know who you're dealing with and that they are reputable and subject matter experts. So have you seen what are the recent obstacles for you, your region, for growth and success?
It's a good question, and unfortunately, the cannabis industry, there's a very long-winded answer to that. In short, you could break out in a variety of ways. I think here in California, we've had a somewhat rocky rollout of regulations. Getting a true official license has been a hurdle for a variety of companies, and really just an unclear regulatory framework. I think being a small business owner in this space is extraordinarily difficult. Staying on top of regulations, which I think have finally settled somewhat here in California, and it's more of the implementation phase, which is inherently less chaotic than when regulations were changing every day. Much like what we saw in Washington when one-day gummies were made completely illegal, and then I think it was 4 weeks later or 3 weeks later that was kind of rolled back. So I think staying in line with regulations and staying off the radar of any sort of enforcement. Here in California, the amount of cannabis that is produced is absolutely astronomical. Unfortunately, a very large percentage of that is ultimately bleeding into the black market. And the price differentials is wild. I mean, you can go and you could purchase an eighth from a dispensary for $60, or you could purchase, a pound on the black market for under $1,000. So there's a lot of hurdles to overcome in that regard in terms of out competing the black market, and especially doing so compliantly. So regulatory broadly is one huge area. And then certainly there's the aspect of banking. Again, I've got to mention a few times here. I'm sure everyone's at least loosely familiar with the Safe Banking Act. I really do think this is something that we can actually, in one form or another, anticipate being passed sometime in 2019.
You're jumping ahead, Andy. That's the next question. I'm going to cut you off. So hold up.
All right.
I wanted to talk to Jason about headset data, because in 2015, flower was the largest segment. We saw the overall market share decline from 64% to 58%. Pre-roll products barely held on to their position as the second largest segment back then. Pre-roll saw nearly 90% of their sales at a price point of less than $10 each. So profit margins declined in 2016 slightly in every category except flower, edibles, and pre-rolls. The average retail cost per gram in 2017 declined by over 25% to just over $15, and wholesale price was as low as 8 cents per gram last year. So with the addition of equipment and automation, can increased volume make up for lower prices?
depending on, I guess, the regulatory structure, the business model, or time scale, it could kind of go either way. But one of the, I guess, benefits, I mean, most people look at it as kind of a pain right now, but we already have really reduced prices in Washington State. And so I think in a way that maybe is a little bit of a blessing when it comes to automation, because generally automation is what drives that price down. I don't think there's a whole lot more room to go down, at least in Washington. There might be some room to automate and scale pricing in California, it sounds like, but that'll get sorted out even without automation over a few years too, because we saw obviously $4,000 or $5,000 pounds when we started, and we're nowhere near that. So I think one benefit that we have is the fact that we do already have extremely depressed pricing. That I don't think there's much room to get lower. And some of the big players already do have some pretty large scale automation in our state. And so I think it's more a factor of finding those automated solutions for the small and medium sized players so that they can automate without spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on each individual piece of equipment. You know, finding those $5,000 or $10,000 solutions that really help you compete. You know, you're never going to compete with the big guys, but you do need to have some level of automation, in my opinion, even if you plan on being a craft boutique type of farm, because labor is in any business a very expensive thing, and it's going to continue to get more expensive. You know, we just in our state, we just got $15 an hour in Seattle, and it might spread out to the whole state. It sounds like there's a big push nationally, so that's also driving automation, I believe, just outside of cannabis, just as a whole. If all of a sudden you got to pay $15-20 an hour to pay a human, it's going to drive those factors even more.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, technology these days is becoming less and less expensive. So, just for example, you can buy, Raspberry Pi controllers on Amazon for, $100.
Right.
Those same controllers, 5 years ago, would cost you $500.
Yes.
And that's what That's what got me into the industry, was trying to automate my grow room. I brought in a couple guys from Amazon to make an Arduino automation system. So we brought that to the wine industry, brought it to a few wine merchants, and told them we could increase their yields by 40% instead of using the timers by day, you're using lumens and humidity and soil moisture, because Red Mountain is probably got better wine than anywhere in Sonoma Valley. And that mineral content is different on whatever slope of the hill. If you have water content that's soggy at the bottom or dry at the top, all of that is into consideration. So you need automation, and all that stuff is a lot more affordable.
Yeah, full 1200 DPI label printer 10 years ago was completely unattainable to any small business. Now you can have one for $10,000.
Right. It sits on your table.
It sits on your table. So automation's getting a lot more affordable, and unfortunately now there are automated solutions that are effective that a smaller type business, I think, can afford, especially once we get the banking thing resolved. That's really the big one that we're going to be talking about.
But I'm curious if the addition of equipment and automation can increase volume to make up for lower prices within the cannabis industry.
Every manufacturer is working ultimately to have a profit margin, and any automated process needs to be aiming to maintain or increase that profit margin. So the minute you create efficiencies, which saves on labor and increases capacity, then obviously the machine is an asset to cannabis producers.
It's like a bowl and a bullpen. It needs to come out. So this question about cannabis banking.
The designated hitter.
That's it. Yeah. So I will note that Organigram out of Canada is rolling 40,000 joints a day. And so that is going to be a game changer. When they do that, everyone else is going to either have to white label with them or change what they're doing, because they're not going to be able to keep up. You just don't see people in North America making cigars, and that's for a reason. So anyway, let's move on to the cannabis banking. This thing needs to come out. So there's a recent congressional hearing on cannabis banking, as Congress has been urged to allow legal cannabis business access to banking and lending services. So, Andy, you've probably already noticed that the Cannabis Trade Federation hired 15 D.C. lobbyists to push for U.S. cannabis law reform. The former House Speaker Boehner got hired by a cannabis lobbyist group, and the World Health Organization recommended cannabis rescheduled as a controlled substance. So how would potential changes to the cannabis banking affect the lending landscape of the industry, and therefore the ability to acquire new automation machinery and investment in the cannabis and cannabis businesses?
let me just reiterate that safe banking it's actually very far along in terms of the regulatory cycle. It has incredible bipartisan support, and again, so right now we kind of have the Safe Banking Act, we have the States Act. The States Act, I have to admit, I'm somewhat ambivalent about. It would essentially push it would push cannabis down to the states and make it a states issue, and it would ultimately leave a fragmented market, much like what we actually had with the repeal of alcohol prohibition. While by all means great as an investor, it does have implications for the way the market will look down the road. Safe banking, on the other hand, is something that I think absolutely everyone in the space can agree on. As an investor in this space, it is extraordinary the degree to which we've lost bank accounts, been hassled by banks, closed without notice. You name it, it's happened to us. So with the introduction of safe banking, the amount of capital that's going to pour into the space is going to be astronomical. And actually, leveraging the John Boehner, joining Cannabis Advisory Board, he actually joined Acreage, and actually just yesterday, Canopy Growth, the largest cannabis company in the world by market cap, actually purchased through some financial engineering, purchased an option to buy Acreage for $3.4 billion. And so what we're kind of seeing already is that when we start, as this industry formalizes, scales, and we begin to start talking about very seriously large numbers, the regulatory framework can kind of bend around that. And I think that's what we're starting to see. And I think with the formal passage of the Safe Banking Act, competition for capital is going to be astronomical. Interest rates are going to go from, I typically see, it's probably around 50% now. About a year ago, it was closer to 20% for cannabis businesses. We could see that rate plummet all the way down to, 6, 7, 8%. For example, I have a car loan at like 2%, just by comparison, to show how low that really can go. And in conjunction with that, up to this point, all institutional capital has been sitting on the side. So when we talk about BlackRock, we talk about JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, all these institutional investors want to enter the space. They simply have mandates that they can.
BlackRock is
as soon as that's. I'm sorry?
BlackRock got in the game last week.
Oh, no kidding. I'll have to look into that. I
think it's like 100.
They're huge.
Yeah, they're in the game.
No kidding. And again, that's a perfect example of how it's even before the SAFE Act passing, large amounts of money are starting to find ways into the space through creative means. And so I think you're going to get two big things are going to happen. With the increased amount of capital, you're going to get a reduction of rates, and you're going to get a lot of companies getting juiced up with outside capital. But I think while that's generally very good for players in the space, I think it'll actually represent another extinctionary event within the U.S. cannabis framework, in that if you're a well-run operator, you've effectively optimized your operations and automated them. You've invested in capital assets that are durable, and you've got a plan to be a robust business, 5, 10, 20 years out. I think this is great for you. You're going to watch your valuation inflate, and you're going to capture a lot of upside. There is the contrast, though, that as additional capital comes into the space, it's going to exacerbate the disparity between struggling operators and successful operators. And so, candidly, I think it might be an opportunity for, if you're a struggling operator in Washington and you've yet to, really achieve any sort of, EBITDA or net income for that matter, you could see your competition get hundreds of millions of dollars invested into them and functionally crush you by further automating and reinvesting in capital assets in their businesses. So it's going to be climactic. I think the M&A is going to be absolutely intense. Again, this Canopy purchasing of an option Acreage is just a taste of that, and we've kind of gotten little bites here and there in the M&A markets. I think Oregon actually right now is really heating up from an M&A perspective, because I think investors are starting to realize that market has finally sort of hit a floor, and sort of the struggling operators have kind of stepped out and allowed the more skilled and operationally efficient operators to scale and take that market share. So yeah, it's going to be wild. It's definitely going to be a pretty climactic, 6-12 months once that passes. And certainly from the investor perspective, it is the time is now to really build that position and capture that updraft.
It's amazing what happens when you use other people's money. When you look at Amazon You look at Starbucks. Starbucks would just open up a shop right next to one another just to keep the competition out, and then lower prices so that mom and pop shops go out of business, and then they can charge you $7 for a 50-cent cup of coffee. You look at Amazon, and there's business models where they tried to acquire a diaper company in the Northeast that the manufacturer of diapers said no. And then so Amazon just lowered the price to the point where they were losing money, but that company went out of business. And then guess what? They'd raised it to normal prices. So I think with access to capital, you're going to see a lot more strategic plays. In Washington, we saw an individual a couple years ago open up an arcade in an area just simply to keep out a retailer because there's a 1,000-foot limit on any children's businesses. So what some people thought was ruthless in the cannabis industry is really just normal business practice. But we're starting to kind of get woken up to that, I guess, pretty harshly, I guess, in the cannabis industry where everybody hugs you before they even really know you. So things are changing, that's for sure. There's still some innovative obstacles, Jason. So the nascent cannabis industry is one of those things where there's constant change requiring a mastering of perpetual transformation. So why is automation so important?
We were just talking about with the next wave of scaling that's inevitably coming, a smaller operator making the right investment or two right now could very well position themselves to, show a larger investor down the road that, hey, maybe I didn't have the capital, but look at the efficiencies that I did squeeze out with the money I have. And if you can show a larger investor that, this is what I've done with what I have, and if you just pour some money on me, we can get bigger. That's what, like I said, that's what investors are looking for, is people that have already shown, they're not going to come in and save companies that are struggling because you're struggling. You've got to at least show that you've got a good business model in place. And so, with some smaller scale automation solutions, that might be one way to, maybe you're that mid player and you're trying to get a little bit larger, make those smart investments now, so that when the investments start coming into our state, that maybe you're one of those lucky people that gets that windfall of investment capital to really take yourself to the next level.
And a follow-up, Arnar or Denny, there's most organizations are designed to execute and not innovate. So why is innovation so hard?
Well, first and foremost, again, a lot of these people coming into this space are not. They're not product developers, right? Maybe they have some money, or maybe they've had a passion to get into the industry. But to be successful at product development, it takes a lot of expertise in that market to know what products are going to be good products and what products are going to be just ignored by the consumers. And we talked earlier about you go into these dispensaries and you've got 300 SKUs on the wall. How do people even make a decision?
Headset said that there was only maybe 5% of retail shops in 2016 that had more than 1,000 SKUs. And now that's going the other way, where there's almost 20% of stores that have 2,000 SKUs. And I walk in, I'm just like, how do people make a decision? How do these bud tenders recommend or decide when there's so much involved in getting it there, and then you're drowned by it once you're there?
Right. And I think that's where your product quality really comes into play here, because that's really the only thing you have to stand against somebody else. Or you can have flashy packaging, you can have great marketing gimmicks, but at the end of the day, the person is going to pick the thing that looks the best to them. They don't get to smell it first. In a lot of markets where it has to be sealed, or sometimes you don't even get to see it in these markets where you have to have opaque packaging. Right. So you're buying on the reputation of the packer, the quality maybe that you got the last time. And so it's super important to hold that quality and to set yourself apart from the people that are just mass producing or just trying to get as much into a bag or a jar as they can at the lowest cost. Right. At the end of the day, that may come back to not be a good thing for you. Running your process that way. So there's a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of the know-how that has to go into that. And I think a lot of these guys are just learning that now, right?
And to piggyback off that too, I mean, when it comes to your packaging itself, like he was saying, I mean, the packaging oftentimes can get you a sale, but it's ultimately going to be the quality that brings them back. And but that packaging is ultimately, especially in our state, it really is a huge factor because we can't really smell, and we kind of have a smell system that nobody really participates with. So we don't really have a robust ability to really smell or experience the product before you buy it. And so the packaging is really key at first. But if you put a really high end package in with a really, maybe it doesn't even have to be a low end product, but maybe it's like an affordable product, it confuses the customer. And I've seen a ton of that in this industry where, I'm going to do like in the early days, I'm going to do this really nice bamboo lid jar. It cost me $1.50 a jar. And then you grade bud in there. Mm-hmm. And then you got $1.50 cost on your packaging and your competitor's paying 30 cents. Yeah. You're not going to survive that.
Yeah, there's a lot of issues. Either it's 4% humidity and it just crumbles, or there's powdery mildew, or there's issues. And so I've gone back to my trusted dealer in the black market. And so I'm going to echo what's happening in Canada. We could see from headset data, or maybe that's not headset, but there's some data out there in Canada where oil is not selling as much as flower. And I think every market would show you the opposite is happening. And so if it's not in Canada, I think that's a really good indication that quality is garbage. If you're selling black oil, people don't want to dab that. If you're selling powdery mildew or dried out flour that doesn't really have any terpenes or smell, or it doesn't have a real good value, people are going to find that elsewhere. And I think that's going to be black market.
Or radiated marijuana, right? That's not what they're doing.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Sterilize it or something. I don't know.
I think branding is just starting to come on the cusp, whereas no one cares about Snoop Dogg. You can see that in the numbers. But I think where it will lead to is where can I get that consistency? And Starbucks consistently makes terrible coffee, but people go there because they know what to expect. And if you can create something that is consistent, I think regardless of the quality, people will go to it. And we just don't even have that yet. If we can have quality and consistency, that's ideal.
Yeah, consistency is definitely a huge issue in our industry for sure. And I think that's also another reason why I don't tend to see a lot of brand loyalty when it comes to the consumer. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's that many, regular cannabis smokers that are like, I only smoke this brand.
No, I don't see that at all.
Because and I think one of the big reasons for that is even some of the quote unquote most successful processors and producers are still struggling with putting out the same consistent stuff. And so, and then we're reading about how, especially when extraction processes occur, it's branded as a, Granddaddy Purple, and then you test it and it's not even that anymore, because they actually took 4 or 5 strains and, extracted it all together. And so those kinds of things, I think, are also issues that guys like us can't really fix as we're ancillary people, but those are quality issues that the producer processors really need to get their head around, I think, to kind of create that brand loyalty. I really don't think we have much of that yet in the state, and I think that's a really big step to get there, is to be able to consistently know as a consumer, right? If I buy this strain or this chemo bar from this company, it's going to be this experience every time. Yeah. And that's what all the corporate industry does. Coca-Cola, like it or not, it's consistent. Yeah. So
yeah, we need GMP practices. You can't have 10 out of 10 joints tested and come up 100% moldy. Rolled mold, you can go to Jim McRae's website right here. Power of editing. And so he tested 5 infused, 5 non-infused joints, and they all came back moldy. And so whether it's oil that has Eagle 20 or mold, if it's not good and it's not trusted, then there's going to be alternatives and backlash. People will go into that black market, and you're going to lose capital. There's going to be some lawsuits for sure.
I heard a story about a processor in Southern California that was producing edibles, and they ran out of distillate, and so they kept producing the edibles. 0 cannabinoid.
I do have some questions about valuations. We'll maybe pivot to that in a moment. But Andy, I want to ask you about Canadian capitals. The top investing trends that I mentioned earlier were multi-state operators and then data when we were talking about headset. And then behind that is the consumption lounges or cannabis cafes with specific investment drivers being vape, accurate dosing technology, and beverages. So, Andy, are you seeing U.S.-based multi-state operators poised to deploy big money in 2019? Or is it still just Canadian cannabis companies increasing their cross-border acquisitions and deals like we saw with Harvest being purchased by Canopy?
It's a great question. I think we're finally hitting the point where, in the early days, Canada received all the hype. These massive grow operations were funded. But we have to keep the perspective that, this is an equatorial plant, and the capacity in Canada right now, which I know currently there's signs of shortages, but when you take consideration everything that's going to be built, I think we'll ultimately have a massive oversupply coming out of Canada, especially in light of global low cost producers like Colombia, Portugal, Macedonia, coming online and essentially flooding the market with extraordinarily low cost extract and isolate. With that said, I think the investor focus is finally pivoted to some of the U.S. multi-state operators. Great companies like Green Thumb Industries that's actually focused on a very strategic strategy of breaking into new markets, building out their own facilities so they're vertically integrated, and then ultimately building a brand from the ground up. It really is a brilliant method in the grand scheme of things, and I think that people are realizing that the U.S. market is far and away larger than Canada. And actually, I love the comparison. So, talking here from San Francisco, California alone, as it compares to Canada, is actually significantly larger. Slightly lower in population, but significantly larger in terms of GDP, and especially in terms of overall market size. When you take into consideration, tourism, all the traffic that heads to LA and Tahoe and things like that. So I definitely think,
just to clarify, California has the 5th largest GDP, and that's behind, in the world, and that's behind, the United States. So yeah, it's huge.
Fair point. Exactly. So I think, capital is flowing more freely to these large MSOs. There's increasing consolidation taking place as well. And so I think that, 2019, and especially, with the potential catalyst of the Safe Banking Act, they're ready to deploy into every market that opens, to begin building out the necessary infrastructure and optimizing that across the supply chain, both in terms of branding, production, et cetera. And actually just adding to, the conversation from just a moment ago, I couldn't agree more about the quality and consistency issues, that exist currently in the industry. And I think that's case point number one for why, true, institutional machines, manufacturing practices, GMP, et cetera, why that's so needed. And I think as that enters the space and as companies, MSOs like GTI, for example, adopt those and implement them. I think they will be the companies powerful enough to execute on that. And by virtue of that, we'll build the brands where people can trust that if I do, 1 mint, I'm doing 2.5 milligrams. Not I'm going to do 3 mints, feel absolutely nothing. And then on my 4th mint, I'm going to lose my mind. Since that's not ideal.
Yeah. There's still a lot of people who are wanting to know the effects, and they will convert over from alcohol. There's been a lot of talk about that, so hopefully that'll play out. There's some California companies that are contacting me right now for homogenization, and so that's still 10 years later. It seems like that should have been figured out already, but we're still there. What are you guys seeing with Green Vault Systems? Are you seeing more Canadian clients coming in wanting your machinery, or is it more emerging markets in the U.S.?
Well, Canada's kind of an emerging market.
Sure.
Along with a lot of the states, especially on the East Coast. We just came from an industry convention there in Boston, and those are some of the biggest emerging markets.
Yeah, Boston's huge.
What you have in Canada versus these emerging markets in the U.S. is, like Andy has talked a lot about here, is the access to capital, right? And it's almost an overabundance of capital in Canada. People are making decisions, investment decisions that because they can. You know, they're buying things because they can. You know, and they're almost mandated by these corporations, the heads of these corporations, to invest in equipment to show assets, and not necessarily making good investment decisions, buying the right equipment.
I sold $85,000 worth of PreRoll equipment, and then that was just a bridge. But and then the next year, like right now, there's probably $1 million because each machine then was about 10 grand, and now is 150 grand, and they're buying the same number of machines. Right. And so that $100,000 order turned into $1 million order pretty quick. But they don't care. It's other people's money. It's like that's what worked then, and what works better now. I'll take it.
Where the emerging markets here in the U.S. are making more educated decisions, and
because they have to, right. So I guess that's the one upside of the slower process, the slower rollout of Washington, is it's forced these guys and gals to be more educated and more smart, or pay the consequences ultimately. You know,
that's right. And I talked about some of these equipment providers, you know, that make peanut and jelly bean machines, that would love to get their money on the green rush, you know, get their hands on that green rush money, right?
Yeah, and
they don't care if it works or not.
Right.
Yeah, no.
They get the sale, that's all they care about, and then they'll walk away. Where you know, companies like us, we're involved. You know, our partner company, Green Bros, we are 100% cannabis, and all of our engineering efforts, all of our customer support and everything, we are vested in this industry like our customers, and so we're not going anywhere. And we, in order to live and die, we have to make sure that we provide them with the right solutions that are going to have a return. And so we consequentially, in these emerging markets in the U.S., where people have to be smart with their money and don't have money to throw away, these other players have kind of got up to Canada because it's easy picking, and they're not even. There's even a company in just outside of Boston, equipment manufacturer, automation provider just outside of Boston, that wasn't even at the Boston show.
Wow!
Because they've just given up on the U.S. market more or less. Yes, they just kind of pull the wool over somebody's eyes. That's interesting. So, and that's got to be careful. There's a lot of wolves out there.
You definitely do. I mean, I would echo that exactly what he said. Is that I go to the Pack Expo every year, which is the big packaging expo. They do it every other year. It switches between Chicago and Vegas, and I've done both now. And so that's basically like the global packaging show for all industries. And I've gone and talked with a ton of major companies there, and of course, every single one of them wants to get in the cannabis space. But then when I start asking them the tough questions and specifics that I know I'm looking for, very few of them can actually either say yes, we can do it, or they kind of say yes, and I know they're full of crap. But that's where we do that process of really vetting the people we work with. We don't manufacture any equipment. We kind of go out and find people like Greenvault that are reputable and do a good job, and then if there's an opportunity to help, we distribute their products. That's kind of our space in the equipment world. We started out as a packaging company, but we really saw a huge need for automation because I saw so many of my customers hand packing joints, hand stickering labels, hand doing every last little piece. And I'm like, you're not going to be here in 5 years. That's not sustainable for any industry. And so, like I said, some of those smaller tabletop solutions are key. And the companies we've partnered with, we vetted them for our customers. And so, we make sure that preferably it's a North American-based company. If they are sourcing some materials out of China, they still have a U.S. office. They've got U.S. support. You've got technical support, so if your machine breaks down, you're not calling China in the middle of the night to get your machine fixed. Understanding what your parts are that you need, the replacement parts, making sure they're in stock and ready, or if they're not, If you know a replacement part takes 2 months, you better know that up front, not when your machine breaks. I've heard stories of some of these pieces of equipment out of China where, it's maybe half price of the U.S. guy, but that really key component you got to replace every year takes 8 weeks to get because they don't even stock it in China. They wait till you call them and then they put you on the manufacturing line as they have time, and then they'll get it to you eventually. And like you were talking about downtime, that can kill you in the cannabis industry, to be down for 2 months, forget about it, you're done.
Right, traditional tobacco or cigar rolling machines, if you move them even just 1 foot, it literally takes a week to get that thing up and running. So downtime can kill you. You can't have innovation that's too complex. And so if you have a mobile processing unit, for example, that would never work. And so looking at the future, there's some top investments for innovating the future of food. This is Main Street or the real world.
And are you seeing U.S.-based multi-state operators calling you and visiting you in Israel, or are you seeing Canadian companies?
Both. Also, you have to remember today that some of the U.S. companies have gone public in Toronto, so I'm not quite sure what to call them, but we're getting both from the United States, from California, from all over, Washington State, California, Florida, New Jersey, and of course all the Canadian provinces as well have expressed interest. Basically, anybody who's seen the video and comes out to see the machine, we're opening up production lines of serious numbers of machines to provide in the next 8 to 10 months. Our delivery time is today at 10 weeks. We can deliver the machine to the clients in North America.
And so, Andy, let's start with you. I'm seeing some top investments being like cooperative packaging solutions, mobile processing, mobile pack houses, improved traceability technologies, farm to fork virtual marketplace, which sounds cool. There's mobile education centers and behavioral economics for agriculture. And so that's all just Main Street stuff. What's the most interesting thing you've seen in 2019? New, neat, niche, whatever's trending? Or how do you see the cannabis industry advancing?
Let me just start by saying, when it comes down to the science of cannabis and sort of these emerging technologies, I'm a total nerd. And so I actually, again, there's kind of two ways of looking at, disruption and innovation. There's sort of this marginal disruption that actually works really well in the cannabis industry because cannabis is already so disruptive and innovative. And then there's this completely brand new type of innovation that's rare, broadly speaking, and certainly therefore much rarer in a niche industry like cannabis. But cannabis is also very ripe for that because it's so unexperimented with. So I'll just start off by saying, we all know THC, we all know CBD. And taking but there's over 100 active cannabinoids in cannabis and potentially many more, as it seems we're constantly discovering more. And also, funnily, it seems like there's a confusion around which ones are real and which ones are made up. But story for another day. But so just THC, when that's metabolized, again, so once it's oxidized in the liver, it generally speaking becomes this kind of 11-hydroxy tetrahydrocannabinol, which is extraordinarily interesting. It's the high we get from edibles, generally speaking. It's water soluble, so it would circumvent all these issues we're currently experiencing with surfactants and emulsification and homogenization. So that's one really cool area. Just this idea of new novel cannabinoids. And what I think is really neat is this broader industry of cellular agriculture. So this is the idea of essentially, say, taking yeast or stem cells and growing them in vivo in bioreactors to produce particular outputs. So we have Ginkgo Bioworks partnered up with Kronos Group to pursue this, to the idea of producing cannabinoids from bioengineered yeast. And for some reason, this gets the hype that this is going to bring down the cost of THC or CBD. I'm not really sure that's the case because you look at industrial hemp or you look at cannabis sativa, we can already produce plants that yield 20 to 30% of this particular cannabinoid. So I'm not really sure that cellular agriculture will revolutionize those cannabinoids, but some of these lesser known cannabinoids and how those are metabolized and what the impacts are, especially this entourage effect. One of our founders, Emily, was actually recently on a trip. She was essentially due diligencing an opportunity and was speaking to a very, very intelligent scientist who kind of a few years ago pivoted and committed his life to cannabis. And he made a statement that I think is everyone really needs to understand, is that he said, we understand about 1% of this plant and its potential. And so I'm really excited for the way that's going. And again, just novel use of cannabinoids and their interactions. And I think another area, and I'll have to be careful how I word this as ultimately it is an investment. And so I need to be cognizant of that. I'll just say broadly speaking, we have a few ways of ingesting cannabis. We can smoke it, which we know there's risks to that, just like smoking anything. There's vaping, which I think is increasingly getting scrutiny that, it's still not great for you. And actually to take a viscous oil and turn it into an aerosol still requires heating it anywhere from 400 to 800 degrees. That creates formaldehyde, other noxious compounds. Then we can consume cannabis orally and ingest it. And then there's these patches and some of these other form factors. We're currently invested in a completely novel form factor, something that has never existed in any other space, at least not in this particular variation. And so I'm really excited to see how cannabis will actually drive the complete revolution of how we take drugs and broadly speaking interact with them and view things like microdosing. I can tell you before moving out west and kind of joining the industry here in California, the notion of microdosing was completely foreign, and the idea of using cannabis but not actually getting high. But it turns out that's probably the best way to use it, in terms of lifestyle and wellness and a lot of these other verticals. So, I'll just kind of summarize this with a few key statements. There is a lot of R&D being thrown into cannabis, and I think the outcomes of it are going to be revolutionary. I think the way that we consume and ingest cannabis in literally just 1 to 5 years time will make this kind of joints and THC CBD conversation seem juvenile. And I also really want to emphasize that the hype that CBD is getting today, which is literally the market's on fire. Again, I was just in New York, and it's everywhere you go. There's CBD coffee, there's CBD this, there's CBD that. Again, that's just one cannabinoid. There are a variety of cannabinoids in cannabis, and they all have very unique effects. And doing CBD alone, I would agree there are benefits to it, but I think that there's a lot of hype around it. And I think it will be 1 to 5 years until we really get the research to understand the formulations, whether it be a combination of CBD and THC, which I think we're all aware of is far more advantageous to CBD alone in isolate. I think those new form factors variations will be pretty exciting. I'm looking forward to it.
I love it. Thank you. Any of you guys got anything that you have seen that's new, neat, or niche, something that's trending that you've seen in 2019 that you want to share?
I don't know. Maybe Andy's heard a little more about this, or I don't know if you have heard about this story. But there is, I guess, one of the beverage companies that's partnered with one of the large Canadian players. And the story that I read a while ago was that they were actually going to try to essentially create a cannabinoid-based drink that would have the same onset and offset of an alcoholic beverage. And that's one of the big concerns with edibles, obviously, is knowing when it's going to hit me and how long it's going to last.
Right.
And so if that's actually happening right now, and if that's one of those big R&D projects these big players are working on, I mean, that to me is an obvious game changer. The second you can give somebody a non-hangover related beverage that responds similar to alcohol without the negative side effects.
If I could pile on that, so I actually have a theory. So again, historically, people have been essentially taking delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, the active ingredient in cannabis, and they've been applying different surfactants to basically make it emulsified in water. That's great, but then you do get this issue of the surfactant has to dissolve until that delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol hits your system. And then you have this long cannabis cycle where you have the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which goes through your system. Every, I think it's like 30 minutes, you have, a certain fraction of your blood actually passes through the liver. And so you start getting this trade-off from delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol to this 11-hydroxy tetrahydrocannabinol, and then further to COOH tetrahydrocannabinol, which is non-psychoactive and actually serves to reduce the psychoactive effects of the former two metabolites. So I have a theory that some people are finally beginning to crack this code, which is actually to follow that chain down and start with 11-hydroxy tetrahydrocannabinol, which has a shorter effect since it's already as if it's been pre-metabolized in your system, which would only take 1 to 3 hours for your typical person. So they're able to achieve a shorter half-life, again, closer to alcohol, kind of 1 drink, 1 hour is sort of the equation there. And I think we're getting kind of this marginal change to surfactant technology. And I love to kind of pick people's brains in this because almost all surfactant technology out there, and this emulsification and hydrosonic, emulsification, this technology from the 80s. And if you go on, ScienceDirect.com, for example, this is very old technology. It's very rudimentary and it doesn't work very well. But because of cannabis and the nuances of cannabis and the profit to be made in cannabis, scientists and engineers all over the world are reopening their these conversations around this technology. And I've yet to see anything that's truly blown me away yet, but I think the potential for the science is there. And hopefully we got something like that very soon. I can't wait.
That's awesome. I really appreciate, out of any podcast where you can nerd out on, this is the place to be. So appreciate that.
Good deal.
CPA gave me a scientific view. That's awesome. Anything you guys want to add to that? Awesome. Andy, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Andy with Poseidon Asset Management. I appreciate you being on the podcast. There's Arnar and Denny with Green Vault Systems. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. We have Jason Lammers with 420 Wholesale Pack. Thanks again. And with that, I really appreciate you all being here with me today. So with that, we're going to roll this one up. I'm Josh Kincaid. This is your Cannabis Business Podcast, The Talking Hedge. Like, share, and subscribe, or don't, and I'm out.